Good evening. My name is Miriam Udell, and I'm the Judith London Evans Director of the Tam Institute for Jewish Studies, and it is my delight to welcome this capacity crowd to the 2026 Tenenbaum Lecture. First, I have to thank the numerous, I believe, actually record-setting number of co-sponsors who have joined with the TAM Institute this year to support this lecture. Emory University's Office of Campus Life, the Candler School of Theology, the Center for Ethics, the Department of English, the Department of French and Italian, the Department of German Studies, the Department of History, of Middle Eastern and South Asian Studies, of Religion, Spanish and Portuguese, the Fox Center for Humanistic Inquiry, the Institute for the Liberal Arts, Laney Graduate School, the Medieval Studies Program, the Office of Spiritual and Religious Life, and we always feel a great sense of support coming from the college itself, and we are so pleased to acknowledge Tom Rogers, Associate Dean of Humanities, who's joined us tonight representing the college administration. This morning, our speaker, about whom you'll hear more in a moment, delivered an excellent seminar. And he spoke in the course of it about expulsions of Jewish communities, as he will develop further tonight. And he mentioned the idea that sometimes for the individual families or communities that have to leave a place, it's actually not a tragedy for them personally. They can go on and flourish elsewhere. And the Tenenbaum family lectureship in Jewish studies salutes a family who lived that reality. It honors the family of the late Meyer W. Tenenbaum, class of 31, Emory Law School 32 of Savannah, Georgia. Meyer was a native of Poland who arrived in the United States at age 13, knowing no English, and graduated from Emory School of Law 11 years later. In 1939, he wedded LaBelle Birnbaum, a native of New Britain, Connecticut, and a graduate of the Russell Sage College in Troy, New York. They had 3 children, Davida, Samuel, and Karen. Meyer joined his brothers Albert and Ralph in the scrap iron business in 1942 after practicing law for 10 years. He helped to build and eventually presided over the Chatham Steel Corporation, now a major steel service center with headquarters in Savannah and branches across the Southeast. Meyer loved Emory and credited this institution for so much of the good fortune that he enjoyed in his life. He passed away in 1986, and his family established a full scholarship at Emory Law School in his memory. LaBelle Tenenbaum died in 2001 and is memorialized through the LaBelle Birnbaum Tenenbaum Enrichment Fund for the Tam Institute for Jewish Studies. The lectureship honors the entire family and its ethos of citizenship and public service, which is still expressed through its support of religious, educational, social service, and arts institutions wherever Tenenbaums live today. We want to highlight a couple of upcoming events that might interest you. On April 13th, the Center for Ethics at the Center for Ethics, the Fox Center for Humanistic Inquiry will sponsor a book launch event for our colleague, Dr. Craig Perry, for his new book, Slavery and the Jews of Medieval Egypt. A week later, on April 20th, we will celebrate my new book on modern Jewish world-making through Yiddish children's literature. The Tenenbaum lectureship, because it consists of a seminar and this lecture and various other parts, involves a lot of staff consideration. You don't just fill a room like this by snapping your fingers. So I want to thank our communications and events director, Brent Buckley, for his efforts, and our longtime curriculum coordinator, Mallory Mibab, And my last task while I am up here will be to introduce and express my deep gratitude to the co-chairs of this year's Tenenbaum Lectureship, Professors Tamar Menashe and Craig Perry. Craig is an historian and assistant professor at Emory University, where he serves in the Tam Institute and the Department of Middle Eastern and South Asian Studies, as well as the Islamic Civilizations graduate program. His teaching covers the broad sweep of Jewish history, Jewish-Muslim relations, and everyday life in medieval Egypt. A specialist in the history of medieval slavery, Professor Perry served as co-editor of the Cambridge World History of Slavery. In 2024, he was awarded the extremely prestigious Rome Prize in Medieval Studies from the American Academy in Rome, and we are just thrilled about the release of his recent book. Tamar Menashe is the J. and Leslie Cohen Assistant Professor of History and Jewish Studies. She graduated from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, summa cum laude. She holds a master's degree, a couple of master's degrees, and a PhD from Columbia University in the city of New York. She is a historian of the law who focuses on minorities and early modern empire, gender and women's history, religion and law, interfaith relations, medieval and early modern history, Jewish studies, German studies, and interconnected Iberian and German histories, Ashkenazi and Sephardi histories. Basically, if it's Jewish and medieval, she pulls it together with deep curiosity and real panache. So you can see why these two scholars were so interested in bringing tonight's lecture. And now I am happy to vacate the lectern and turn it over to them. One job.
Thank you. All right. Good evening, everyone. Can everyone hear me all the way to the back? Thank you. Shalom. Guten Abend. Buenas noches. And welcome to this year's Tenenbaum lecture. My name is Tamar Menashe. I'm a professor at the Department of History and Jewish Studies. And it is a great pleasure to introduce you tonight our keynote Tenenbaum speaker for 2026, Professor Rowan Dorin of Stanford University, who is not only a brilliant and the most eloquent legal scholar I know of, but also a good mentor and a friend. I will unlock my iPhone because I have a kindergartner who knows how to get to Amazon. Right. So, Professor Dorin is an associate professor of history and the director of the Center for Medieval and Early Modern Studies at Stanford, as well as core faculty of Stanford's Taub Center for Jewish Studies. As you will hear him saying a bot, he's born and raised Canadian, Western Canadian, and he pursued his undergraduate and doctoral studies at Harvard University, followed by a postdoctoral fellowship at the Harvard prestigious Society of Fellows. I can say that when I was a graduate student at Columbia University, I took a seminar with the late Robert Bob Chazen, who is one of the most important historians of canon law and the Jews. And he was very excited to introduce us one day to a hot manuscript. And the manuscript with Rowan Dorin's, and he said, you'll read it now and you'll see that this is, a revision of everything that we know about moneylending Jews and canon law. And he was quite right, because Rowan's book won numerous awards across every possible area of study, including Jewish studies, legal history. The Canadians have acknowledged their prestigious, he really got everything possible. And this book was reviewed more than 21 times. That's a lot. In multiple languages and every possible genre of journals that you can think of. And his book that he's going to talk about tonight is titled No Return: Jews, Christians, Usurers, and the Spread of Mass Expulsion in Medieval Europe, that came out with the prestigious Princeton University Press in 2023. Among the many accolades and awards that he got, I'll just mention one, is the 2024 Sally Barron Prize from the American Academy for Jewish Research. And without further ado, I would introduce the title of tonight's talk, The Road to 1492. The rest of it, well, you all know how to read. So thank you, Rowan, and welcome, and thank you very much for coming tonight.
Can everyone hear this is good? Okay. Thank you, Tamar, for the introduction. Thank you for Miriam for this kind invitation. Thanks to Brent for organizing. And thanks to all of you for being here. I fear that the road that I'll be leading you along this evening is not a very happy one, but presumably this won't come as a surprise given the title of the lecture. So following in the footsteps of most medieval chroniclers, let me begin my talk this evening at the very beginning of time. For everyone in the Middle Ages, and for many Jews, Christians, and Muslims today, history began with an act of expulsion, the banishment of Adam and Eve from paradise. As for mass expulsion, over the last century, it's been so commonplace in so many countries across so much of the globe that it seems almost embedded in the fabric of human societies. Modern international law forbids mass expulsion, or more precisely, collective expulsion, defined as the deportation of an entire class of people from a given country. But as we know too well, the practice persists. And yet, by historical standards, the proliferation of collective expulsion is a relatively recent phenomenon. Ancient empires regularly uprooted their subject populations and relocated them to other places within their dominions. Just think here of the people of Judea being carted off to Assyria or Babylon. And Roman authorities frequently banished offending groups from the precincts of the capital, or even from peninsular Italy as a whole. But as was first observed by the Israeli historian Benjamin Kadar 3 decades ago, the expulsion of whole classes of people beyond imperial boundaries was all but unknown under Roman rule. And the practice remained equally rare in the successor kingdoms that followed, as well as the Byzantine and Ottoman empires. It was only in Western Europe, during the High and Late Middle Ages, that collective expulsion first emerged as a characteristic feature of political practice. This is important because it suggests that collective expulsion is not a timeless or inevitable feature of human societies, however much the horrors of the 20th century, and increasingly the 21st as well, might have entrenched the practice in contemporary consciousness. And if we understand collective expulsion instead as a practice that emerged and spread within a particular set of historical circumstances, then we can start investigating both the conditions under which it emerged and the mechanisms by which it spread. By way of analogy, we might think here of the enormous amount of research that's been done over the last half century on the history of mass incarceration, which is another relatively recent phenomenon by global historical standards. Historians who work on nearly every place and period have mapped the rise and diffusion of practices of confinement, tracing how we've moved from a pre-modern world in which incarceration was exceptional or even unknown to one in which it's endemic. But almost nobody has sought to tackle the history of expulsion in the same way. Consider the recurring expulsions of Jews that scar the history of medieval and early modern Europe. I need hardly stress for this audience the degree to which these have shaped Jewish experience or left their imprint on Jewish communal memory. So it's only fitting that these have been the focus of painstaking work by generations of scholars. For the most part, scholars have framed these within the broader context of persecutions of Jews. Expulsions are therefore analyzed alongside state-sponsored confiscations, legal restrictions, pogroms, and all the other awful things that people in the past have done to the Jews and Jewish communities who lived among them. There are good reasons for this scholarly approach, not least that it aligns with the venerable intellectual and liturgical tradition within Judaism itself, in which the tribulations of the Jewish people are collectively understood as the result of sinat Israel, hatred of the Jews, which can take many forms as it manifests itself across time and place. Those of you who will be participating in Passover Seders 2 weeks from now might well vocalize such an approach in singing or reciting the traditional text, the Hishamda, with its reminder that in every generation, enemies rise up to destroy us. Such an approach also underpins one of the greatest works of Jewish history writing, Solomon ibn Verga's Shevet Yehuda, which the author wrote after being driven from Spain in 1492, and which recounts 64 episodes of Jewish persecution and draws connections between them. And there's no doubt that we've learned a great deal about the dynamics of Jewish expulsions by framing them within a wider context of Jewish persecution. But what if we make expulsion the object of our analysis? What if we start not from the targets of persecution, but from the tools? In other words, what if we frame Jewish expulsions not from the perspective of what else was being done to Jews, but from the perspective of who else was being expelled? Let me start by showing you quite briefly what such an approach might look like for England, which has the dubious distinction of being the first country in Europe to expel its Jewish population. This expulsion occurred in 1290 during the reign of Edward I, who was most famous for thumping the Welsh and the Scots in battle, but who also brought an end to England's once thriving Jewish community with an expulsion order that would not be reversed for 400 years. But England's broader collective expulsion, the history of collective expulsion, actually begins earlier, in the mid-12th century, when Edward's great-grandfather ushered in his reign by expelling all foreign mercenaries from the realm. And over the next century, English kings, including Edward's grandfather and father, repeatedly banished other communities of foreigners from the realm, often amidst trading disputes with Flanders or military conflicts with France. And starting in the 1240s, Edward's father, the very long-reigning, very pious, and perennially broke Henry III, also began repeatedly ordering the expulsion of Italian merchant bankers from the realm, usually on the grounds that they were engaging in illegal moneylending. In fact, the real reason that Henry expelled these Italians was because they refused his demands for bribes or cheap loans, and the threat of expulsion was one way to encourage them to pay up. As for his son, King Edward, he follows suit upon taking the throne, first expelling Flemish merchants from the realm as part of a commercial dispute, and then a year later expelling Italian merchant bankers on charges of usury, forbidden moneylending. Right after expelling these Italian merchant bankers, Edward goes on to prohibit the kingdom's Jews from lending at interest, i.e. from engaging in usury according to a strict Catholic definition of the term. So in 1290, when Edward expels the kingdom's Jewish community on the grounds that they were persistently violating this earlier prohibition on usury, he's not just building on a long tradition of expelling perceived outsiders from the realm. He's building on quite a robust tradition of expelling perceived outsiders specifically on grounds of usury. Now, I'm skimming over a hugely complex situation here, and for those of you who are deeply interested in the nuts and bolts of medieval English history, if there are anyone here, I'm happy to go into more detail after the talk. But one piece of evidence is worth highlighting because it's gone entirely unnoticed by all the scholars who have examined Edward's expulsion. In the late spring of 1290, at the same time that Parliament was urging King Edward to consider expelling England's Jews, it was also pushing Edward to expel foreign merchants from the realm. Edward refused the latter demand, declaring that he, quote, he understands that the merchants are suitable and useful to the leading men of the realm, and he is not advised to expel them. So instead of just seeing 1290 as the final dramatic blow to medieval England's Jewish community, which it certainly was, we can also understand it as a moment in which Edward is choosing to expel one group while refusing to expel another. And that comparison suddenly opens up a host of new questions that we can ask. Why at this moment were the foreign merchants deemed useful while the Jews were deemed expendable? Who were the advisors who succeeded in convincing the king that one group should be shielded from expulsion, notwithstanding the same parliamentary pressure, and so forth? When I began working on my book, I thought it might end up being a comparative study of medieval expulsions, in which the very well-studied expulsions of Jews would serve as a backdrop to my new research on the expulsions of heretics and prostitutes and lepers and foreign merchants. In the end, I had to abandon the heretics and the prostitutes and the lepers. They make a few passing mentions. And what was initially envisioned as a comparative history of expulsion became, to my surprise, a connected history of expulsion. Let me show you what I mean by 2 maps. This first map shows the territories that ordered expulsions of Jews in the 250 years before the Black Death. As you can see, it's centered on the Kingdom of France, along with basically a few territories on the edges of France. There's the Duchy of Brabant to the north, the County of Burgundy to the east, Dauphiné down to the southeast, as well as the Kingdom of England across the Channel. And if you're looking really carefully, you'll see a little outlier in central Italy, which is the city of Perugia. Now let me show you a second map. This is a map of the territories that ordered expulsions of foreign Christian usurers during the same period. To make the comparison clearer, let me put them side by side. As you can see, the 2 maps are almost identical, except the Christian map includes a few other territories up in the Low Countries, as well as the Prince-Bishopric of Aquileia at the top of the Adriatic Sea. From the beginning of the 13th century to the middle of the 14th, every major European polity that ordered the expulsion of its Jewish community also ordered the expulsion of foreign Christian usurers. I'll repeat that. Every major European polity after the Black Death that ordered the expulsion of its Jewish community also ordered the expulsion of foreign Christian usurers. It's conceivable that this geopolitical overlap is pure coincidence. I hope you'll agree that seems unlikely. I first stumbled across the repeated expulsions of Christian usurers while looking for something else, which is how an awful lot of historical research projects get started. They seized my attention because they didn't fit into the usual Jews usury expulsion narrative that I was familiar with, and it's a staple of medieval history textbooks and Jewish studies courses. Now, notwithstanding the assertions of some zealous medieval clerics and some equally zealous 19th and 20th century anti-Semites, it is blatantly untrue that in the Middle Ages, all Jews were moneylenders. The more interesting misconception, not least because it remains so widely believed within the modern Jewish community, is that in the Middle Ages, only Jews were moneylenders. This misconception tends to be bolstered by references to the medieval church's vociferous and repeated condemnations of Christian usury, ignoring the simple fact that repeated condemnations are usually a sign of persistent practices. After all, for Dante to find Christian usurers in hell as he does here, some Christians must have been lending at usury. Now, I've been throwing around the word usury here without actually saying what I mean by it or what people in the Middle Ages might have meant by it. Both now and then, usury is essentially any interest on a loan that exceeds what is permissible. Under Roman law, which remained widely used in much of medieval Europe, the maximum allowable rate of interest was 12%. But in both Catholic theology and law, any interest on a loan qualified as usury, and hence is forbidden, with a few rather complicated exceptions. Meanwhile, professional moneylenders in the Middle Ages, Jews and Christians alike, often received formal licenses from local authorities, allowing them to charge up to 2 pennies per pound per week, or 43% per year, which sounds bad, but is considerably below the threshold of what Georgia allows for loans for non-bank lenders, 60%, while pawnbrokers in Georgia can go even higher. So in practice, if you were lending money in the Middle Ages, the same loan might be perfectly licit under secular law and blatantly usurious under church law, which meant that you might be a moneylender in the eyes of one person and a usurer in the eyes of another. So when I use the words usury and usurer this evening, I'm transmitting medieval accusations about what someone was doing, which might have very little connection to their actual economic practices. In short, money lending is a practice. Usury is an accusation. So getting back to my story, professional Christian moneylenders spread rapidly across much of Western Europe in the 13th and 14th centuries. As you can see in the map here, there are attested activities north of the Alps. Often called Lombards or coercions, the impact of their geographic diffusion is still visible in the urban topographies of 21st century Europe. Think of London's Lombard Street or Paris's Rue des Lombards. More striking still is the fact that Lombard eventually came to serve as the word for pawn shop in several European languages. And in light of later anti-Semitic tropes, there's a certain irony in the fact that one of the languages in which Lombard means pawn shop is Yiddish. Even very distinguished scholars have been led astray by the assumption that medieval moneylending was monopolized by Jews. One of the most widely cited articles on the topic of medieval Jewish moneylending relied on 3 documentary sources, all of which the very distinguished author believed to be records of Jewish lending activity in mid-13th century northern France. Now, 2 of these 3 documents do indeed record Jewish loans to Christian borrowers. But the 3rd document is almost certainly a roster of loans made by Christian lenders, suggested not only because the names of the 2 lenders are typical of Christians rather than Jews, but also because one of the things they accepted as collateral was a small herd of pigs. And while halakha doesn't forbid accepting pigs as collateral, it definitely smells a bit off. Now, just as Jews were frequently expelled on grounds of usury over the course of the Middle Ages, so too were Christians. Within the Kingdom of France alone, on at least 10 occasions before the middle of the 14th century, a fluctuating blend of moral opprobrium, political expediency, and fiscal concerns spurred rulers to order the expulsion of foreign Christian moneylenders, the so-called Lombards or coercions. And as is clear from the maps that I showed earlier, these expulsions weren't limited to the Kingdom of France. So as I dug further, it became increasingly clear to me that medieval expulsions of Jews could not be fully understood without considering the association between usury and expulsion in contemporary rhetoric and practice, which also engulfed many Christian merchants and moneylenders. Pursuing this association led me through a broad array of sources, from chronicles and legal commentaries to account rolls and notarial registers, and from theological treatises to popular songs. And I'm showing a sample of them here just to give those of you who aren't lucky enough to be professional medievalists a sense of their physical variety, to say nothing of the differences in handwriting and language and so forth. As you might imagine, the sources are widely scattered and often fragmentary, and I ended up consulting material from over 150 archives and libraries in 16 countries, a task that I will say made far easier by the friendly assistance of local archivists and librarians, along with the enormous increase in digitized manuscripts available online. Many of those became digitized after I'd gone to the trouble of going seeing them, but at least it's now easier to follow in these footsteps. The connections I uncovered over the course of this research are bound up with migration patterns and credit networks, the meaning of foreignness and the limits of citizenship, even the forbidding thickets of biblical exegesis and legal hermeneutics. And I apologize to anyone here who actually works in the forbidding thickets of biblical exegesis and legal hermeneutics. Now, never fear, I'm not going to attempt to lead you through all of that during the remainder of my talk this evening, even if I do have a captive audience. What I'd like to do instead is to highlight one of the book's principal themes, namely how ideas and practices of expulsion spread across the intellectual and legal landscape of medieval Europe, and how these ideas and practices of expulsion could mutate and evolve as they moved across time and place and genre, engulfing new targets along the way. And then I'll zoom out again at the end and try my best to articulate why any of this matters and why we should care about what happened so many centuries ago. Many of you have likely heard of King Louis IX of France, the Saint Louis whose name graces the city on the Mississippi, and whom lovers of medieval cathedrals will remember as the king who commissioned that jewel of Gothic architecture, the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris. Saint Louis, as his pious moniker suggests, was terribly concerned about both the moral purity of his realm and the salvation of his soul, with the two concerns really being inextricable from one another. He was accordingly the first French king to swear to extirpate heretics from the realm as part of his coronation oath. He also pushed for the expulsion of prostitutes from urban centers in the kingdom. See, the prostitutes did make it in eventually. He was also deeply influenced by the theologians at the University of Paris, who were articulating increasingly hostile attitudes towards virtually all forms of moneylending. By the time of Louis's accession to the throne, these thinkers were pretty unanimous in agreeing and arguing that it was not only those who lent at interest who were guilty of sinful wrongdoing, but also those who profited from this money lending or who enabled it to take place. And insofar as Louis both protected the realm's Jews and taxed their wealth, some of which came from money lending, and likewise protected the kingdom's resident foreigners and taxed their wealth, some of which also came from money lending, he was conceivably tainted by the sin of usury. The king's response was first to threaten with expulsion any Jews who persisted in usurious money lending within his domains, and then to threaten the same penalty against foreign Christian lenders, the Carousins and Lombards, who had been openly lending usuriously on pledges within our realm, having set up houses especially for this purpose, in which they greatly impoverish our realm through their usurious extortions, and they are said to commit many evils within their houses. In my book, I trace the diffusion of this logic of protection, hence complicity, which underpinned many subsequent expulsions of Jews, as well as Christian foreigners accused of usury. And I also follow the many ripple effects of Louis's policies, not least King Edward I of England's later prohibition of Jewish usury, which lifted key phrasing verbatim from the legislation of his saintly counterpart, and which served as justification for the eventual expulsion of England's Jews. But the influence of Louis's expulsion orders extended not only across the Channel, but across nearly all of Western Europe. In 1274, or 4 years after King Louis died of dysentery while leading his army on yet another failed crusade, the Pope convened a general council of the Church in Lyon, a city just beyond the southeastern boundaries of the Kingdom of France. Some of the participating bishops had written in advance to raise continued concerns about the spread of usurious practices in their dioceses, and so the gathered prelates approved new measures against usurers, which were theoretically binding on all of Latin Christendom. The decree in question opens with the image of an all-consuming abyss of usury, usurarum veroginem in the Latin, which became the shorthand way of referring to the decree. Inspired by King Louis's example, and drawing in some cases exactly on his wording, usurarum veroginem ordered all secular and ecclesiastical rulers to expel from their lands within 3 months any foreigners who were engaging in usury. It also forbade anyone from renting houses to such usurers, and it imposed a raft of serious penalties for transgressors. The decree's demands marked a milestone. Where previous medieval expulsion orders had concerned cities, or duchies, or even kingdoms, this decree's provisions theoretically embraced all of Latin Christendom. Not since the age of the late Roman Emperor Justinian had a European authority issued such a sweeping and categorical call for the collective banishment of wrongdoers. And so far as Catholic canon law was concerned, the decree remained formally on the books until 1917. This meant, of course, that for centuries to come, and even in places where there was no prior tradition of expelling wrongdoers from one's communities, people could listen to a traveling preacher or flip open a manuscript and suddenly discover that certain classes of people should be so punished. Now, it was a chance encounter with medieval manuscripts when I was an undergraduate, studying economics at the time, that spurred me to become a medieval historian, much to the then regret of my poor parents. It turned out okay in the end. And I'll take any excuse that I can to go hunting for medieval manuscripts, especially when that means working in places like this, or this. Conveniently for me, as a result of usurarum veroginum's codification in church law, its expulsion provision ended up leaving traces in manuscripts across Western Europe, not just in formal compilations of church law, but also in textbooks for law students, handbooks for confessors, manuals for preachers, even a really terrible poem. Now, one of the things that became increasingly clear to me as I looked at more and more manuscripts and got further and further into the research for my book was the gap between the church's authoritative statements, as formulated, for example, in conciliar decrees and compilations of canon law, and more local understandings. These local understandings are often irrecoverable, but sometimes we catch glimpses of them in student notebooks, in synodal statutes, in sermons, in songs, and so forth. And these glimpses make clear what we all know intuitively from our own experience playing the telephone game as children, but which medieval historians and historians of the late medieval church often sidestep or ignore. Namely, that what popes and councils actually declared could look awfully different once it had been run through the mill of scribal errors, oral reworkings, syntheses, summaries, and shifts in genre. Even where the decree's text was transmitted accurately and in full, its precise meaning was open to dispute. For one of the things the drafters did not do in crafting the decree was specify whether it was to apply to Jewish usurers as well as Christian ones. This is probably because it never occurred to the drafters that it might be used against Jews. The 13th century church hierarchy certainly denounced Jewish usury, but it never tried to forbid it outright. Moreover, one of the few constants of the medieval church's teachings on the Jews have been a strong resistance to their expulsion. This position rested on the sturdy foundations of the letters of the Apostle Paul, along with the writings of St. Augustine. And over the course of the High Middle Ages, a series of papal rulings on the topic buttressed it yet further. Good Christian authorities could impose all sorts of unpleasant restrictions on Jews, and indeed, church law actively encouraged them, insisted that they do so. But expelling Jews, that was another matter altogether. Throughout the 13th century, church thinkers were virtually unanimous in asserting that Christian authorities could not justly expel Jews simply because they refused to become Christian or because they otherwise held to their traditional practices. Goodness knows there were plenty of medieval Christian authorities who ran roughshod over this tradition, or who sought compelling arguments to get around it. But even in the 14th and 15th centuries, a period that saw such disruption and dislocation for Europe's Jewish communities, this tradition was far from meaningless or moribund. Moreover, it's clear from a variety of sources, including the draft versions of the decree and eyewitness accounts, that Usurorum Viragum's provisions were aimed at Lombards, that is, the foreign professional Christian usurers. But the language of the promulgated decree was unintentionally ambiguous. It spoke only of foreign usurers, and given the context of today's lecture, you can already guess where this ambiguity would lead. Even if Jew was a protected category in Catholic theology and law, usurer was not. And at no point in the later Middle Ages did the church hierarchy clearly establish just how far the increasing repression of usurers could infringe on the established protections for Jews. And thus we find anti-Jewish interpretations of the decree being advocated by German and Italian bishops, by the most famous law professor in 14th century Europe, by the most acclaimed preacher in 15th century Italy, even by a pope, although the pope reversed his decision after being confronted with eyewitness testimony about the actual intentions of the decree's drafters. Whatever your preferred approach to constitutional interpretation in the contemporary United States, for 15th century Italian Jews, it was a good thing that the Pope deferred here to original intent. Now, I don't want you to come away from my lecture thinking that reinterpretations of this decree underpinned every instance of Jewish expulsion in late medieval Europe. Far from it. Moreover, mainstream legal opinion, as represented by the standard medieval commentary on the decree, stressed that its penalties were a response to illicit Italian lending. And the same point features at the very start of the commentary on the decree in the first papally authorized printing of the Corpus of Canon Law. So it was there, like, for anybody who went looking for it, the restriction to Italians. But there were obviously an awful lot of people who didn't bother to read legal commentaries. And even some professional canon lawyers didn't read them very well, as evidenced by a legal opinion written by a renowned Italian law professor, Giovanni da Legnano. Now, Giovanni was so famous that he even earned a mention in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, juxtaposed with his near contemporary, the Italian humanist and poet Petrarch. And I've given you the excerpt here, basically, Francis Petrarch, the famous poet, that was his name, the name of this clerk, whose sweet rhetoric illuminated all of Italy with poetry, as Giovanni Legnano, did with philosophy or law and other arts. But even Giovanni da Legnano's own students criticized him for his occasional sloppiness. And in this rather cursory legal opinion from sometime in the 1370s, in which Giovanni reviewed all the ways in which a bishop might punish Jews engaging in usury, he concluded, Without elaborating further, the Jews were indeed subject to Usuram Viraganam's housing ban and expulsion provision. And this opinion ended up being copied down by many of his attentive students, whom you see figured here on his tomb, or by those who encountered the opinion during their legal studies in Bologna or elsewhere, and then carried back copies to their homes in the Abruzzo, or the Netherlands, or Transylvania, or Saxony, or Bavaria, or the many other places that manuscripts of this legal opinion might have ended up. And I'm still in the process of tracking them all down. At least one such student, a native of Bavaria, encountered it while studying in Padua several decades after Giovanni di Legnano's death, and he made a copy of the opinion in his personal notebook. A few years later, this student carried this notebook back with him to his hometown of Eichstätt in Bavaria, where as a canon of the cathedral, he was soon active in the election negotiations for the city's soon-to-be elected bishop, who was not only his cousin, but had also studied law alongside him in Padua. Among the conditions that the cathedral chapter imposed on the new bishop was a promise to expel all the city's Jewish moneylenders, the first time such a promise had featured in an election agreement in Eichstätt. Now, I cannot prove that the canon drew on his copy of the opinion to persuade either the chapter or the bishop-elect of the necessity of expelling Jewish moneylenders. But given that he had copied it in his own hand, had brought it back with him to Bavaria, and given that it specifically concerned the responsibilities of a bishop towards Jews engaging in usury, and had been penned by the most famous law professor in Europe, certainly seems possible. Over the past 40 years, scholars of medieval persecution and repression have often faced a supposed choice between overarching paradigms and local specificities, with those trying to analyze broad societal transformations, encountering vigorous protests from their colleagues who insist on the variability of local conditions. In my book, I've sought to overcome this false dichotomy. I simply don't believe that we can explain local instances of the expulsion of usurers without considering how the association between usury and expulsion first came to be thinkable and eventually normative. Conversely, we cannot account for the spread of this association without considering why it clusters in some places and not others, is discussed in some genres and not others, is applied to some targets and not others, and so forth. If one were to look only at the codified text of Usuram Viraganam, maybe even alongside its standard commentaries, one would overlook all the ways in which the authority underlying a conciliar decree ended up buttressing rather significant local reworkings of the decree's language and provisions. And yet, at the same time, these local reworkings risk being almost invisible or seeming insignificant in the absence of broader comparison. In the case of Eichstätt, for instance, one might reasonably ask why it was that in 1445 the cathedral chapter pressured the bishop-elect to expel the city's Jews, whereas earlier episcopal elections show no such efforts. And to answer this question, historians would typically look to the specific personalities involved. Who was the bishop? Who was in the chapter? They'd look at the social and economic conditions of Eichstätt during the preceding years. They'd look at what was happening with nearby Jewish communities. One probably wouldn't try to connect this sudden shift to a conciliar decree that had already been circulating for nearly 2 centuries, or even to a legal opinion written by a prominent Italian jurist 70 years earlier that advanced an argument that pretty much no other contemporary canonist agreed with. And yet, I can't help but think that there's something significant in the fact that the expulsion of Eichstätt's Jews came about only after a powerful local cleric returned from his studies in Italy carrying a copy of this opinion in his satchel, an opinion that offered fuel or at least legal legitimation for such a move. Only rarely can we trace the movements of new ideas at such a granular level. That fact alone is reason to be wary of attempts to identify the causes of any given episode of expulsion. What we can do, however, is explore how the circulation and accumulation of certain ideas and practices made expulsion ever more likely as a historical outcome. To understand the spread of mass expulsion in medieval Europe, to understand, in short, how a practice that had been vanishingly rare in earlier periods became widely embraced, even routine, by the end of the Middle Ages. It's therefore necessary to look not just at broad changes in religious and political structures. We must also be alert to the humble pathways by which new ideas, new norms might be circulated and preserved and rediscovered, often undergoing reworkings and reinterpretations along the way. We must even pay attention to individual manuscripts and the shifting norms and networks they reveal. But I've also tried to show this evening how one cannot explain the proliferation of expulsion in medieval Europe by looking only at the collective expulsions that prove the most dramatic or widespread or enduring, the expulsions of Jews. It seems clear to me that along with studying the history of persecutions within particular groups, we must also study the history of the practices that cut across them. One must equally grapple with the expulsions of those who may not be conventionally reckoned among the persecuted, but who fell nevertheless within expulsion's reach. Such a comparative approach not only helps us understand the expulsions that did take place, but also sheds light on those that didn't. Why were Lombards expelled at one moment and Jews at another, or both together, or none at all? Comparison allows us to glimpse the roads not taken, the choices not made. And comparison sometimes even reveals unnoticed connections, as in the twisting paths by which a 13th century decree concerning Italian moneylenders could have inspired 15th century expulsions of German Jews. But for those of you who are not lucky enough to be professional medievalists, who aren't about to go digging about through dense manuscripts and dusty archives in search of such comparisons and connections, why should any of this matter to you? It matters, I think, because it reminds us that expulsion, like all social practices, could be observed and repeated and taught and imitated across space, across time, across different categories of targets. The way that the history of Jewish expulsions has usually been explored has framed it, whether explicitly or implicitly, as a characteristically, even singularly, Jewish experience. Yet I hope my work serves as a reminder, if any such reminder is needed these days, of just how easily the persecution and oppression of any one group can become a template for the subsequent persecution and oppression of others. We are so often urged to learn from history, but the arsenal of the past can be wielded for evil as well as for good. Legal norms, administrative procedures, intellectual categories, linguistic habits molded and reinforced one another, and manuscripts could preserve what memory might forget. And with each successive expulsion serving to further disseminate and normalize the practice, the expulsion of any one group made it more likely that others would suffer the same fate. Now, I'm coming to the end of my time, and I've not yet said anything about the Jewish expulsion that is alluded to in the title of my talk, the most famous, perhaps most consequential expulsion of them all, that of 1492. The first draft of my book, in fact, made no mention of it. But after reading that draft, one of my Jewish studies colleagues, who gave this lecture a decade ago, told me that I couldn't write a book about Jewish expulsions in the Middle Ages and not mention 1492. I pointed out in my defense that my book was really focused on the link between usury and expulsion. And unlike so many earlier expulsion edicts, as the students of Professor Perry's class found out yesterday, Ferdinand and Isabella's Alhambra decree, ordering Jews who would not convert to Christianity to depart from their kingdom of Castile, famously focused on questions of Judaizing and conversos and said nothing about Jewish usury. It was just the anxieties around mass Jewish conversion, lingering Judaizing influences, but not moneylending. My colleague was unmoved. Somehow, I had to say something, and something new, about 1492. So I did what we all do. I prayed for a miracle. And lo and behold, further sleuthing revealed that a different 1492 decree for Ferdinand's kingdom of Aragon had been rediscovered a few decades ago. But almost nobody knew about it, and even those who knew about it hadn't studied it much. As with its Castilian counterpart, The Aragonese Edict began by condemning Jewish subversion and apostasy, here embellished with the language of leprosy and contagion. King Ferdinand then turned the matter of Jewish usury, denouncing the Jews for, quote, wickedly and mercilessly consuming the wealth and property of Christians through their enormous and unbearable usury. The edict then continued. Given that these Christians who have come to another land to be usurers must be expelled from cities and towns, how much more should infidel usurers, seducers of Catholics and abettors of heretics be expelled and kept apart from Catholics for the preservation and protection of both their souls and the Christian religion? The echoes of Usurarum Viragonem are clear, even if the royal reasoning was new. If even foreign Christian usurers merited banishment, then surely the penalties for Jews, here collectively denounced as usurers, ought to be at least as severe. Here it was irrelevant that Usurarum Viragonem did not target Jews. In this transformed logic, whatever punishments fell on Christians, Jews should suffer the same or worse. And thus, did a canonical sanction devised 2 centuries earlier to slow the spread of Christian moneylending come to play a supporting role in the great act of intolerance against Jews that signaled the end of one age and the beginning of another. Thank you.
Professor Dorin, thank you so much. From lunch at the General Muir to the Jewish Studies Seminar Room to tonight, you never disappoint. So thank you again. Looking at the crowd, I just want to also make one remark before we begin the question and answer session. Can you raise your hand if you're an undergraduate student or a graduate student here? Yeah, excellent. We're thrilled that you're here. This event and others like it are for you. And to paraphrase a bit of Jewish wisdom from the 2nd century, you're not required to ask a question during the question and answer session, but neither are you free to let the wheels stop turning. Okay. So we have several minutes now for anyone in the room to ask a question. So please let me know. I see 1 hand, 2 hands. I'll start here, and then I'll come over here.
Sure. A bit around sort of usury, first why people did it, and then how it ended up being treated. So all societies have needs for credit. And the world of the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries in Europe saw a civilization that had been pretty quiet pick up speed in economic terms. That generated all sorts of demands and needs for credit and capital. And there's a classic argument that Jews ended up being forced into money lending because they weren't allowed to do anything else. That is true at the end of the Middle Ages. It's not true at the beginning. The reason that Jews go into money lending in the 11th and 12th centuries is because there was a need, there was an opportunity, and they migrated to fill this opportunity. Now, most Jews are not engaging in money lending, but some certainly were. And there was no reason for them not to go into this. There was an economic opportunity. It was immensely profitable. I mean, compared to, let's say, crafts work, where the amount that you can make making shoes or making tables or anything else, money lending could generate much, much larger profits and quickly. So just like the Christians who were doing this, Jews migrated to find opportunities to do it. The challenge came about as essentially the church began to get concerned about this developing commercial economy, which was destabilizing traditional relations based on agrarian wealth, and all of a sudden there's new commercial wealth. And so this inspires a great deal of church concern. They begin by condemning Christian usury first. I mean, they're mostly concerned, and there's lots of early texts say, let the Jews do this, protect Christian souls. It's better that the Jews should do this instead. And so Jews continue to spread in this practice, even though Christians are still doing it. As I showed, there's tens of thousands of documented Christian moneylenders who keep doing it, and they figure that they'll just, give money at the end of the days and make a donation of their will and get forgiven, and off they go. Over time, what happens is that the church begins to actively condemn all kinds of usury, as I suggested. And then by the end of the Middle Ages, the only way that Jews can settle in new places is if they agree to actually lend at interest. But for the most part, the church was very, very uncomfortable about profiting from any sort of usury. There are confiscations, But by and large, what will happen is if a king does end up confiscating Jewish wealth, then the church will say, well, you can't keep it, it has to be given to pious purposes. Now, that can occasionally mean that it stays in church institutions, but there's a general concern that nobody should, in fact, be profiting from Jewish usury. So there's strong pressure on rulers who expel Jewish communities that they should not keep the wealth for themselves. They actually have to give it back to the community. And there's actually major restitution campaigns in France in the 13th century where the king sends out teams of people to basically find out who has been paying Jewish usury and make sure that actually their usury is given back to them. So it's a much messier story, partly because some people took these moral claims very seriously. Others, of course, did not. Others happily kept the proceeds. But I was struck in how many of the expulsion orders that I found that kings and other rulers were very wary of keeping the wealth. And so although it's a kind of classic thing that sort of kings might have expelled Jews to seize their debts, that's actually vanishingly rare in the Middle Ages. They would seize their real property, they would seize other things, but they did not, in fact, want the interest because it was seen as morally tainted. And then the Christian wealth, much of it did end up cycling back, but they end up making an interesting argument that sort of early protectionism for basically foreigners. The problem with foreigners is that when they die as moneylenders, they send their money back home. But local usurers, at least, when they die, the money stays around. So one of the reasons that kings and rulers are so concerned about foreign money lending is basically because they see it as a net loss to their communities.
Can you say more about that? How they justify the local ones, but not the foreign one? The money moved, but how about the religion and stuff?
It's a huge intellectual problem in the Middle Ages, this distinction. It doesn't make sense. There is nothing in Catholic theology or canon law that says that the punishment for a given sin should depend on the jurisdiction in which you're sinning. The status of your secular status as a foreigner should have no bearing on the sinfulness. But the language came out, that the church borrowed verbatim the language from the royal decree. They basically took secular legislation and then copied it when they were drafting the conciliar decree without thinking too much of the problems that would create. And it does create problems because legal thinkers afterwards spend a great deal of effort trying to figure out, why does it matter, who's foreign? What is foreignness? In a world of overlapping jurisdictions, of no clear boundary to citizenship, what counts as foreignness? And when I started this project, I actually didn't think it was going to be about any of these things. I was actually working on the history of citizenship and belonging. And I thought that this decree would become an angle for thinking about debates around citizenship and foreign identity in the Middle Ages. And it is that, but then I discovered other things to work on too. But it poses a major theological and legal problem for thinkers that none of them managed to resolve. And they debate it, but it's basically what made sense in a secular context for kings to expel the foreigners who were under their protection, for whom they were personally responsible, was then transplanted into law and then became embedded in Catholic canon law. So the question, I'm supposed to be repeating questions I forgot. So I will repeat the question, which is there any connection between the expulsions of usurers and the expulsions of Moors, basically of Muslim residents in late medieval and early modern Spain? The answer I would say is not directly, but I would argue that the expulsions that get rolling in the early period that are driven very much by usury create a world in which expulsion is seen as a viable political option. So it becomes more normal, more thinkable, and then it's certainly the expulsion of Jewish communities in 1492 that becomes the model for the template of the expulsion of the Moriscos thereafter. But it's a case where the influences are indirect and cumulative as opposed to a direct lineage between them. But there is no question that if we were writing a history of the mechanics of expulsion, that rulers are certainly learning from each other on how to do this. So we can see them copying each other on, here's how to do this effectively, or, I'll impose this sort of policy. As simple as, for instance, rulers discover that you can make your communities pay a tax in order to expel the people they don't like. So they begin occasionally raising taxes, and in return for raising a tax, then they expel the outsiders. So once they discover that they can both confiscate the property of the outsiders and get a tax from their own, that often becomes a staple as well. So we can track those sort of mechanistic copies. And again, it crosses across different targets of expulsion. So you can see they're looking at this and learning from each other. So the question is how do we explain, when there's social relations between Christians and Jews on the ground, how do we then explain this increasing tendency towards corporatizing them, seeing them as a collective rather than seeing them as individuals? One of the things that struck me as I was doing this is I kept on finding myself sort of struggling to think about the relationship between, let's say, like even like mob violence, so things that happen in social communities, and these expulsions that I was talking about. And I realized that it's because there's almost no connection. That expulsions are ordered by government authorities, and they are done by governmental logics, and they exist outside of the social logics of everyday encounters. And so we have extraordinary records of debates, for instance, like in Florence in 1400 exactly, where there's a move to basically bring in Jewish moneylenders into the city, because basically the local communities and the contado are all saying, like, we need to have more credit. And then there's learned debates in the council that are saying, like, we shall not have Jewish usurers in this town because they're usurers and they are forbidden. And so you can see these spaces in which the necessity of Jewish lending is being acknowledged, even as there's sort of official learned discourses that are treating them in a different capacity. And I think this certainly plays out in numerous other cases. When the Jews of France are driven out in 1306, we have poetry that basically, like popular Christian poetry, that says, people were begging the king to bring them back because without credit they were sort of bereft. So we have lots of evidence of popular struggle in the wake of their removal, but that didn't often shape the logics of kings. It plays out somewhat more differently in like German town level expulsions, where in some cases we have municipal governments there. And often there it turns out it's just sort of triangular power plays between different authorities. One of the fascinating arguments of a recent brilliant article by a colleague, Christoten Snitker, is she shows that Jews, if you have one ruler, are quite safe. And if you have many rulers, they're quite safe because power is diffused. But if you have 3 or 4 authorities with authority, that's when they're most at risk in the Middle Ages, because they'll use Jews as pawns in internal power struggles with each other. And so there you get a bit closer to sort of seeing, but the corporate language is interesting. And in fact, again, Professor Perry's students who read the Edict of Expulsion in yesterday's class, it explicitly resorts to the corporate language to justify why it's punishing all Jews for the Judaizing of some, right? Because there are other ways to deal with this, right? When Edward I expels all the Jews of England for the fact that some were sort of violating his prohibition, he could have just had tribunals and punished some. And in fact, that's what he did for Lombard merchants 15 years earlier. When he was accusing them, there actually were full judicial commissions, and he gathered their account books, and he would penalize the individuals who were responsible for contravening his prohibition. So England had the capacity to sort of pursue those who were sort of those individuals. But the corporate logic of Jewish life was such that they negotiated as a community for the protection of the king. They operated as a community. And so the increasing sort of self-presentation and negotiating position of Jews as a corporate form then allows them to be punished for, the sins of some, in fact, fall on the whole community. And it's spelled out, drawing on Roman law, specifically in the Edict of Expulsion of 1492, to explain, like, how is it we're doing that? But they're clearly uncomfortable with it, which is why they actually have to draw out the Roman legal language to justify punishing the many for the acts of it. So some sought to avoid expulsion by, in fact, like invoking their privileges and saying, what we're doing is not contrary to whatever, or they bribed or they strategized. But there are actually legal cases where, going back to the foreigners question that was raised earlier, we have Italian merchants who will say, I'm not a foreigner, I'm a citizen of this town. Even though they in fact were from Italy, but they had gotten local citizenship. And the local town would then say, this is an infringement by the king on our town prerogatives, because they are citizens of our town. And so this is, again, you find these interesting cases of kind of what counts as a foreigner, because the language is so ambiguous. And so we certainly see instances there where so they eventually begin trying occasionally to sort of spell out even more categories to make it clearer of how they get around that, but we certainly see strategies there. In other cases, they marry in local communities precisely to avoid these sorts of things, and then say, well, I'm no longer a foreigner, I've married local. So there are efforts. There's a wonderful privilege, and I don't know how much he had to pay for it, but a merchant in Barcelona gets exempt from an expulsion order. And the king says, okay, well, the expulsion order already exempted those who are married to local women. This guy isn't married, but that's because he's very young and there's still time. And you sort of wonder, like, how much did he have to pay to get that particular reasoning to exempt him from expulsion? But somebody at least had like a very clever lawyer, so, and probably a very deep purse. So, So the question again is essentially, are there shifts in the way? Is there more than just sort of the usury connection, and are there other shifts in the way people are thinking about Jews that are shaping these dynamics that sort of don't apply in the same way to, let's say, foreign moneylenders, and that might nevertheless shape expulsion? So, two pieces of this. First off, as the Middle Ages go on, there is an increasingly wide range of justifications that are given for expulsion, and I try to be careful to distinguish motivations and justifications. There may be lots of motivations for the reasons that somebody wants to expel Jews, but precisely because the church was so clear in its legal sort of approach that Jewish communities were supposed to be allowed to dwell peaceably in Christendom, that set a bar that in order to sort of present your action as legitimate in the eyes of kind of the Christian world, you had to find excuses to get around that. So when they're trying to legitimize it, usury becomes the first common way of doing that. Eventually, there are others that come about other threats to the body politic, and other ways that they're sort of, contaminating Christian life. So it does shift over time, but all of the early ones, the first argument they figure out is around usury. And again, I see that with them figuring out simultaneously with Jews and with others. What's interesting is many of the early expulsions that affect Jews do not apply to all Jews. So the corporateness comes later. But for instance, in 1254, when King Louis IX orders expulsion of Jews, it's only basically Jews who refuse to abandon usury. So it's often treated as like an expulsion of Jews. And in fact, in many texts, it's written like Louis IX ordered the expulsion of Jews. He didn't. He ordered expulsion from any Jews who wouldn't give up usury. And there's this weird conflation in contemporary writing where because people assume that all Jews were somehow either engaged in money lending or they're all tainted, that gets chalked up as an expulsion of Jews. It's not, right? It's an expulsion of Jewish usurers, or Jews who refuse to stop being usurers. It's only later over time that we actually get to sort of more clearly corporate ones. So there's a development there too that we see. Absolutely.
Professor Dorin, I want to thank you. Please join me in thanking our speaker. I have one short comment and then a reminder. So at a university, many of us find community and intellectual inquiry. And in this time of anxiety and uncertainty and anguish, finding your communities is so important. And so I'm delighted that so many people are here from the community outside of Emory and from within Emory. And we hope we continue to gather with you over the course of this semester, which leads me to my reminder, which is that on April 21st, students, we have an end of year celebration for Jewish studies. So please keep a lookout for that. You are all invited. We give away prizes. It's amazing. So you should definitely come. And for everyone in the room, please look for emails from Jewish Studies about the next events in our offerings here at Emory. Thank you, everyone.